The smoke hit Emma Merritt's eyes before she even registered the orange glow on the southern horizon, and in that terrible, suspended moment, she understood with absolute certainty that everything she had built in this valley was about to burn to ash. She stood at the window of the schoolhouse, her knuckles white against the sill, her mind already running calculations that most men in Caldwell Creek wouldn't have thought to make. Wind direction, dry grass acreage, the creek's position, the farms between here and the fire line. She had maybe 4 hours until dawn, and if she didn't act in the next 20 minutes, the valley would be gone by morning. "Get out of my way," she said to Robert Blackwell, and her voice came out low and controlled, which surprised even her, because inside her chest her heart was hammering like a stampede. Robert Blackwell had not been blocking her path. He had simply walked through the schoolhouse door, drawn by the same glow on the horizon, and now he stood 6 feet from her with his hat still in his hand, and an expression on his face that she would remember for the rest of her life. It was not the expression of a man who was afraid. It was the expression of a man who had just walked into a situation he did not yet understand. "Miss Merritt," he said, and there was something in the way he said her name, formal and careful, that told her he already sensed she was carrying something enormous. "The Caldwell Creek Fire Brigade." "There is no fire brigade," she said, cutting him off without apology. "Sheriff Denton disbanded it last fall. Budget. I have been trying to tell the town council for 6 months that this was a hidden threat, that the dry season was going to create exactly this kind of crisis. And every single time I walked into that room, they looked at my chalk-covered hands and nodded like I was reading them a fairy story." She pulled on her coat. "I need a horse. I need every able-bodied person you can wake in the next 15 minutes, and I need you to trust me. Can you do that?" Robert Blackwell looked at her for exactly 3 seconds. Then he put his hat on. "Tell me what you need." What had brought them to this window, to this moment, to this breathless pivot point where the fate of a valley rested on a schoolteacher's shoulders, was a story that had begun 8 months earlier, in the amber heat of a late Kansas summer, 1882. Caldwell Creek sat in a shallow valley in Sumner County, Kansas, the kind of town that existed because the railroad had decided to exist, and not for any other particularly good reason. It had a main street of 12 buildings, a livery stable, a church that doubled as a courthouse on Tuesdays, and a schoolhouse that stood slightly apart from everything else, on a low rise that caught the morning light in a way that Emma Merritt had decided, the first morning she arrived, was a sign that she had come to the right place. Emma had traveled from St. Louis, where she had spent 4 years at the St. Louis Normal School, studying education and botany, with a ferocious, consuming attention that had earned her the top marks of her graduating class and the quiet disapproval of several professors who had not expected a woman to outperform their male students quite so thoroughly. She was 26 years old. She had dark chestnut hair that she kept pulled back during school hours with the discipline of someone who understood that first impressions on the frontier were made in an instant, and she had gray eyes that could shift between warmth and absolute steel depending on what the situation required. She had come to Caldwell Creek because she had written 43 letters to frontier school boards across Kansas and Colorado and received 41 rejections. One offer that paid half what a male teacher would receive for the same position, and one honest letter from the Caldwell Creek School Board that said they were desperate, that their last teacher had married a rancher and stopped showing up, and that they would pay fairly and leave her alone to teach as she saw fit. She had packed her books, her botanical reference collection, her surveying equipment that she had inherited from her father along with his obsessive love of land and maps, and she had come to Kansas. Robert Blackwell was not a simple man, though people who didn't know him often made that mistake because he was quiet, and because the way he moved through the world, on horseback or on foot, carried such easy physical authority that people assumed he was operating on muscle rather than mind. He was 31 years old, the son of a homesteader who had died of fever when Robert was 15, leaving him to work the family ranch alongside his mother and his two younger siblings. He had spent 16 years building that ranch from a grief-stricken inheritance into one of the most productive spreads in Sumner County, and he had done it through a combination of hard physical labor, careful observation of the land, and a stubborn refusal to be defeated by the particular cruelty that the Kansas weather regularly visited upon anyone who had the audacity to try to farm or ranch there. He had brown eyes and dark hair with the first touches of silver at the temples that came not from age but from sustained hard living, and his hands were the hands of a man who had never spent a single day of his adult life doing something easy. He was, by the general consensus of every woman in Caldwell Creek who was not currently married, exactly the kind of man you noticed when he walked into a room, and by the general consensus of every man in town who had worked alongside him, exactly the kind of man you wanted on your side when things went wrong. He had not been looking for a woman. He had not been avoiding one precisely, but his days were full, and his ranch required everything he had, and the particular brand of loneliness that had settled into his chest over the years was something he had made a sort of uneasy peace with. He had not, until the August afternoon when he walked into the schoolhouse to ask about his neighbor's daughter and her reading progress, ever met a woman who made his uneasy peace feel suddenly, startlingly inadequate. Emma Merritt had been standing at the blackboard when he came in, drawing what appeared to be a topographical map of the valley with such precise, confident lines that he had stopped in the doorway without meaning to. The afternoon students had gone home. She was alone, and she was talking to herself, working through something, her chalk moving in quick, decisive strokes. "The prevailing winds come from the southwest in dry season," she was saying, "which means the northeastern slope gets the least moisture retention and the highest fire risk, which means if I am going to convince anyone in this town to take a firebreak seriously, I need to demonstrate the burn corridor mathematically rather than poetically, because these are practical people, and they deserve a practical argument." She heard him in the doorway. She turned without embarrassment or the flutter of surprise that he might have expected, and she looked at him directly. "Can I help you?" he introduced himself. He asked about the neighbor's daughter. Emma told him precisely and warmly about the child's progress, and then she asked him, because she was already studying him the way she studied everything, whether he had noticed unusual dryness in his upper pastures this season. He had. He told her so. She showed him the map. He stood at the blackboard for 20 minutes after that, asking questions that were better questions than she had expected, and she found herself answering with the full depth of what she knew rather than the simplified version she usually offered when people's eyes started to glaze. His eyes did not glaze. He followed her calculations, pushed back on one assumption she had made about the creek's water flow in late September, and turned out to be correct about it based on 10 years of direct observation of that creek's behavior. She had been surprised. She did not show it easily, but she was surprised, and she filed him away in the part of her mind that she kept for things that required further attention. He had walked back to his horse, thinking about topography and fire, and the way her eyes changed color when she was working through a problem, and he had not been able to fully separate those three thoughts from each other for the rest of the day. The autumn months built something between them that neither of them formally acknowledged, because they were both people who moved carefully when the stakes felt high. He found reasons to ride past the schoolhouse. She found reasons to ask questions about the land that required the kind of knowledge he had. There were town socials that they attended without attending together, but that they both found more tolerable than usual when the other was present. There was the afternoon in October when his horse threw a shoe half a mile from the school, and she came out with a lamp and her father's old farrier tools, and he watched her examine the horse's hoof with the same focused competence she applied to everything, and something in his chest moved in a way he was not prepared for. "You know farriery," he said, and he knew as the words came out that it was a stupid question because she was demonstrating it in front of him. My father was a surveyor and an enthusiastic teacher, she said, without looking up from the hoof. He believed that a person who could only do one thing was a person who was one bad day away from helplessness. He taught me to survey, to shoe a horse, to read weather, to cook over an open fire, and to navigate by stars, among other things. She set the horse's leg down and looked up at him. He died when I was 20. The land we were surveying in Missouri was sold to a railroad company for less than it was worth, because my father was the only person who truly understood its boundaries, and he was not there to argue for them. I have been arguing for boundaries ever since. Robert Blackwell looked at her in the lamplight and felt the specific, irreversible sensation of a man who has just understood something he will never be able to ununderstand. "I'm sorry about your father," he said. "Thank you," she said. "He would have liked this valley. He would have worried about the fire risk in dry season, same as me." She handed him back his tools. "You should get the proper shoe fitted in town tomorrow. This will hold for tonight." He walked his horse home thinking about boundaries and loss and the specific courage it took to build something new in a place where you had no history, and he thought about it again when he woke up the next morning and the morning after that. November brought a quiet that the experienced residents of Caldwell Creek recognized as the dry season's last exhale before winter. There should have been rain in late October. There had not been. The creek was lower than usual. The grass on the hillsides had gone from gold to the particular brittle pale that meant tinder, not forage. Emma had walked those hillsides on her Sundays, her botanical reference books under her arm and her father's surveying compass in her pocket, and she had documented what she found with the methodical despair of someone who could see exactly what was coming and could not get anyone to look in the same direction. She had attended 3 town council meetings. She had presented her assessment, with maps and calculations, and she had been listened to politely and thanked, and told that the fire brigade would handle any incidents, and she had explained that the fire brigade had been disbanded, and she had been told that Sheriff Denton was aware and had it in hand. Robert had been at one of those meetings. He had listened to her present, and he had watched the council's expressions, and he had felt the particular frustration of a man who recognized truth when he heard it, and could also see that truth being set politely aside. After the meeting, he had caught up with her on the boardwalk. "They didn't hear you," he said. "They heard me," she said. "They chose not to act. There's a difference." She looked at the southern horizon. It was a clear night, cold and dry. The stars were brilliant and hard. Someone is going to have to act eventually. The question is whether it will be before or after the fire. "What would it take," he said, "to build a firebreak? What would it actually take?" she told him. She had the plan already drawn out because she was Emma Merritt, and of course she had the plan already drawn out. A firebreak, she explained, was a strip of land cleared of flammable material, wide enough and strategically placed enough to stop a fire's advance. For the valley's specific topography, based on the prevailing wind directions and the dry corridor running up from the south, she needed a break roughly 4 miles long, following the natural contour line at the valley's southern entry point. It would require the removal of brush and dry grass across a strip approximately 30 feet wide. With enough hands and the right tools, it could be done in a long, hard night of work. "The town council won't fund it," she said. "They won't organize it. The sheriff thinks the threat is manageable." She paused. "But if there were enough people who understood what I understand about this valley, and if they were willing to give up a night's sleep based on a schoolteacher's calculations," she stopped herself. "You think they won't trust a woman's calculations?" he said. She looked at him steadily. "History suggests they are more likely to trust a man's backing of a woman's calculations. That is a fact I find deeply irritating, but it is a fact." Robert was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Tell me what tools we need." She blinked, which was as close to surprise as she regularly allowed herself to get. "You believe me?" "I've walked those southern slopes," he said. "I've watched that creek. I've been ranching this valley for 16 years, and I've never seen it this dry in November. Yes, I believe you." She believed that he believed her, which was something she had not expected to feel as powerfully as she felt it. She said carefully, "It would be a significant undertaking." "I've done significant undertakings," he said. "Give me a week to talk to the ranchers. They'll listen to me, and I'll tell them they should have been listening to you 3 months ago." She said, "You don't have to do the last part." He said, "Yes, I do. It's true." The week that followed was one of the stranger weeks of Emma's life. She went about her school days with the contained focus she always brought to teaching, working with her students on reading and arithmetic, and the geography of their own state, which she taught with the same maps she used for everything else, because she saw no reason to separate knowledge into arbitrary categories. But in the evenings and on Saturday, she found herself working alongside Robert in a way that felt different from anything she had experienced before. He came to her with reports from the ranchers he had spoken to. 7 of them had agreed to participate in an organized firebreak effort if the need arose. She sat with him at her kitchen table in the small house attached to the schoolhouse, her map spread between them, and she walked him through the detailed plan while he asked questions that were better each time, informed now by 16 years of specific knowledge about this specific land. There was an evening when their hands reached for the same map at the same time, and she felt the warmth of his hand near hers, and neither of them moved away immediately. There was an evening when he brought coffee from the cook stove, and she said thank you without looking up, and he said you're welcome and stood behind her shoulder reading the calculation she was working through. And when she made an error and corrected it herself, he said, quietly, "Caught it," and she laughed, which was a sound he had not heard from her before, open and unguarded, and which hit him somewhere behind his sternum with a force he had not been prepared for. "I don't usually make arithmetic errors," she said, still with the tail end of the laugh in her voice. "I know," he said. "That's why I was watching." She looked up at him then, and they were close in the lamplight, and there was a moment between them that was very nearly a different kind of moment, but she was still Emma Merritt and he was still Robert Blackwell, and they were both people who moved carefully when the stakes felt high. "Thank you," she said, "for taking this seriously." "You make it very easy to take seriously," he said. December arrived, and so did the first small frost, and the town breathed a collective sigh of relief that was entirely premature. The frost was not the rain. The ground hardened slightly but did not saturate. The grass remained brittle. The moisture deficit, as Emma had carefully documented in the log she had been keeping since August, was the worst the valley had experienced in her records, which went back as far as the local newspapers' weather reports and the journals of 3 founding families whose descendants still farmed here. She had borrowed those journals from the families, with their careful permission, and she had read every weather entry with the focused attention she brought to primary sources. What she found reinforced what her botanical surveys had shown. The valley had burned twice in living memory. Both times the fire had come from the south on a southwest wind in late autumn or early winter after an unusually dry season. Both times the damage had been devastating. One family had lost everything. Another had lost their barn, their livestock, and their oldest son, who had tried to save the animals. She brought this information to one more council meeting in December. She brought the journals. She brought the families whose journals they were, and those families spoke. This time, the council agreed to form a volunteer fire response committee and hold an organizational meeting in January. Emma walked home from that meeting feeling something that was not quite victory but was adjacent to it. Robert was waiting on the bench outside the schoolhouse because he had attended the meeting and wanted to know the outcome, and because he had a reason to be where she was that went slightly beyond fire preparedness, and they both knew it. She told him about the committee. He said, "That's good," she said. "It's not enough. A committee that meets in January cannot prevent a fire that starts in December." He looked at the sky. It was a clear, cold, airless night, the kind of night that carried no moisture at all. "I've been telling my ranch hands to have the tools ready," he said. 6 shovels, 4 scythes, 2 firebreak plows. My horse team is fit. If it comes to it, we can be on the southern slope within an hour of a warning." She looked at him. He was looking at the sky, and she was looking at him, and she thought about the way he had said, "I've been telling my ranch hands to have the tools ready," which meant he had already done what she had asked for before she had finished asking for it, which meant he understood the nature of the threat as completely as she did, which was not a thing she had ever experienced before with another person. She said, "Robert." He looked at her. She said, "I need you to know that what you have done, taking this seriously, talking to the ranchers, preparing, I need you to know that it matters very much to me. Not only because of the valley, because of—" She stopped. She was not a woman who left sentences unfinished, and the fact that she had done so told him something important. He said, "I know." And then, because he was also learning when not to move carefully, he said, "Emma." She looked at him. He said, "I have been trying to find the right moment for about 2 months now, and I think the problem is that I keep waiting for a moment that doesn't involve fire preparedness, and it's becoming clear that fire preparedness may simply be part of who you are." She almost smiled. "That is an accurate observation. So I will say it here in front of the schoolhouse, with the fire risk documentation presumably inside and the committee formation presumably behind us," he said, "that I have never met anyone like you, and I think about you considerably more than is professionally appropriate for a rancher thinking about a school teacher, and I would very much like to, if you are willing, take you to supper at the Caldwell Creek Hotel on Saturday, which is not a fire-related event." She did smile then fully, the way she had laughed that evening at the kitchen table, and it was, he thought, the best thing he had seen in a very long time. "Saturday," she said. "Saturday," he confirmed. The Caldwell Creek Hotel's dining room was not exactly a romantic destination by any sophisticated standard, but Emma had been at enough frontier postings to know that the quality of the company mattered more than the quality of the tablecloths. The tablecloths were, in fact, red-checked and perfectly serviceable, and the beef stew was excellent, and Robert Blackwell sat across from her with his good coat and his careful attention, and told her about the ranch in a way that was not boasting but honest disclosure, and she told him about St. Louis and her father and the 43 letters she had sent before she came to Caldwell Creek. 43, he said. "How long did that take you?" "About 3 months, she said. "I was systematic about it. I had a list of school districts organized by geographic distribution, reported student population, and likelihood of accepting a female applicant based on published board compositions. I worked through the list methodically." He looked at her. "Most people would have given up after the first 20 refusals." "Most people don't have a systematic list," she said, "and I don't give up on things that matter." The way she said it was not a boast. It was simply a statement of the fact of who she was, delivered with the same clarity she brought to everything, and it landed in his chest with a weight that was not unpleasant. "What made Caldwell Creek matter?" he asked. She considered this honestly. "The letter," she said, "the honest letter. They told me the truth about the situation, the teacher who left, the difficult conditions, the fact that the students needed someone committed rather than someone passing through. I respected the honesty. I thought, if the people here are honest, I can work with honest people." She looked at him across the red-checked tablecloth. "I was right about that." He reached across the table and touched her hand, which was resting near her water glass. It was a brief touch, deliberate and careful. She turned her hand over, and his fingers rested in her palm for a moment that felt much longer than it was. "I'm glad you stayed," he said. "So am I," she said. And she meant it in more dimensions than she had expected to mean anything when she arrived in Kansas with her books and her maps and her father's compass. The weeks between December and the terrible night of the fire were not all fire preparedness and meaningful glances across restaurant tables. They were, in fact, some of the most complete days Emma had experienced since her father died. They were complete in the sense that she felt fully herself in them, not a portion of herself performing a role, but the whole of who she was, including the parts that she had sometimes thought were too particular, too complicated, too much. Robert did not find her too much. He found her. she gradually understood exactly enough. He came to the school on a Tuesday in late December and sat in the back of the classroom while she taught the afternoon session, because she had mentioned that she was trying a new method for teaching fractions using land measurement as a context, and he was curious. And he was also simply someone who liked being where she was when circumstances permitted it. He watched her move through the room with the easy authority of a person entirely in their element, drawing a field on the blackboard and asking the children to figure out what fraction of it remained after one corner was solved. And he saw in the children's faces the particular animated attention that good teachers produced, which was the attention of people who forgot they were supposed to find something boring because it had suddenly become interesting. Afterward, when the children had gone home and the schoolhouse had gone quiet, he helped her clean the blackboard. "You're good at this," he said. "I know," she said without false modesty. "It's what I'm meant to do. I can feel it when a child understands something new. It's like watching a lamp be lit." She put the chalk away in its careful box. "What is it for you? The thing that feels like that?" He thought about it seriously, which she appreciated because he never answered her questions carelessly. "The morning check," he said. "When you walk the pastures first thing and the animals are well and the land looks like it's going to hold another day and the light is coming up, that's the moment. Not any single success, but the daily confirmation that it hasn't broken down." She looked at him. "That's a profound answer. You asked a profound question," he said. She stood at the blackboard with the clean eraser in her hand, and he stood a few feet from her and neither of them moved. And then she set the eraser down, and he crossed the distance between them, and he kissed her for the first time. There in the schoolhouse, with the afternoon light coming through the western windows the way she had known it would, and the smell of chalk and open Kansas air around them. It was not a tentative kiss. Neither of them were tentative people. It was warm and clear, and it tasted like everything that had been building since August, and when they drew back, they were both entirely still for a moment. Then she said, "I was beginning to think you were going to spend the entire winter asking about fire preparedness." He laughed, and it was the first time she had heard him laugh fully, not the quiet, controlled sound he usually allowed himself, but a genuine, open laugh, and she thought, there it is, the part he keeps back, the part I want to know. "Fire preparedness," he said, "is extremely important." "So is this," she said. January was the first month in a long time that Emma did not feel the particular solitude of the frontier teacher as a weight. She felt it differently now, as a quietness that was chosen rather than imposed, because on the far edge of it was Robert, who came on Saturday evenings and stayed for supper, and whose presence occupied a warm corner of her thinking that she did not try to clear. They talked about everything. They talked about the ranch and the school and the town and the territory and the history of the land they were both, in different ways, trying to understand and protect. They talked about her father and his mother, and the ranch he had built from a grief and a determination that Emma recognized in herself. They talked about the fire committee, which met once and agreed on a plan that was essentially a simplified version of Emma's plan, which did not surprise her. They talked about the future in the careful way that people do when they are beginning to see that the future might contain someone specific, and the thought is both thrilling and enormous. On a Saturday in late January, he arrived for supper with a book he had ordered through the dry goods store, a botanical survey of the central Kansas plains published by a professor at the University of Kansas, and he said he thought she might want it, and she took it from him with the expression of someone who had received exactly the right thing, and she set it on the table and looked at it for a moment, and then she looked at him. "You ordered this for me," she said. "It arrived last week," he said, as if the timing were the relevant information. She reached up and put her hand on his face and kissed him, which was something she initiated because she was Emma Merritt, and she did not wait for things that she wanted when the path was clear. February brought a dry cold that was different from the wet cold the valley needed. Emma walked her regular rounds of the southern slopes and found that the moisture situation had not improved. The brittleness of the dry grass remained. She added to her log and said nothing to alarm anyone, because she had already alarmed everyone she could alarm, and what she needed was for January to have been a wet month, and January had been a dry month, and some things could not be solved by documentation. Robert noticed her silence on the topic one Saturday evening. He said, "The southern slopes," she said, "unchanged." He said, "I moved the extra water barrels to the near barn last week, filled them from the creek while the ice was thin enough." She looked at him. "How many?" "8 large ones. My foreman thought I was worried about the cattle drinking through a freeze." "What did you tell him?" "I told him I had it on good authority that we should be prepared," he said. She held his gaze for a moment with the full weight of what that meant. He had listened to her when she was the only person in the room who understood the danger. He had prepared without being asked, based on what she had taught him, treating her knowledge as trustworthy before any official body had confirmed it. He had seen her. She said, "Robert, and then she stopped because she was not quite ready for the sentence that was forming, which was a sentence about the rest of her life. He waited because he understood her pauses. She said, "I need you to know that what has happened between us this winter, whatever you want to call it, it matters to me more than I have said." He said, "I know. It matters to me too, in ways that I'm still working out how to say." She said, "We are both, apparently, people who prefer to communicate through action." "Yes," he said, "which is why I ordered the book and filled the barrels. And why I showed you the maps in August," she said. He smiled. She smiled. The lamp burned between them on the kitchen table, warm and steady, and outside the Kansas winter was dry and cold and holding its breath. The night the fire came was a Tuesday night in the second week of February, and Emma woke from a dead sleep at 10 minutes past 11 with the smell of smoke in her lungs before she was fully conscious of being awake. She was at the window in 3 seconds. The glow on the southern horizon was not a distant glow. It was too large, too orange, too dynamic. It was the fire she had been calculating for 6 months, and it was already moving. She dressed in 30 seconds. She pulled on her heaviest coat and her father's compass and her work boots, and she grabbed the maps she had kept on the table by the door since October, already rolled and ready, because she had known this was coming and she had prepared for it. She was out the door and running for Robert's ranch when she remembered that Robert was already coming toward her. He had woken to the same smoke. He had saddled his fastest horse. He had sent his foreman to wake the nearest ranchers. He had ridden toward the schoolhouse because that was where he was always going when something was wrong. They met at the schoolhouse door and she said, "Get out of my way," and he said, "Tell me what you need," and they were both already moving. "I need every person you told to be ready," she said. "I need the tools. I need us on the southern slope within the next hour, and I need to be making decisions about the break point because the wind is from the southwest, which is what I predicted, and the corridor runs exactly where I said it would run." She was spreading the map against the schoolhouse wall in the darkness, holding her lantern up, speaking at speed. "Here. The break needs to run here following this contour, but we cannot go all the way to the creek bend because the fire will have already passed that point by the time we arrive. We start here at the old Fenwick fence line and we work north." Robert looked at the map, memorizing. Then he looked at her. "I've got 6 men. My foreman is waking the Hendersons and the Calloway boys. That's another 8 to 10. What about the town?" "You wake the town," she said. "I'll take whoever is ready and start on the south end. You bring everyone else as they come." She looked at him directly in the lantern light. "I know what I'm doing." "I know you know what you're doing," he said. "That's why I'm going to do exactly what you said." He cupped her face in his hands, quick and fierce. "Be careful." She put her hands over his for 1 second. "Go," he went. What happened in the next 4 hours was something that Emma would later struggle to convey to anyone who had not been there, because it was not the kind of thing that translated neatly into words. It was physical and exhausting and terrifying, and also, in a way that she would only understand afterward, deeply clarifying. She rode the borrowed horse to the Fenwick fence line in under 20 minutes, her maps under her arm and her lantern in her hand. Robert's foreman, a steady man named Grover Walsh, was already there with 3 ranch hands, and they looked at her when she arrived with the expression of men who had been told to listen to the schoolteacher. She spread the map on the fence post. She told them exactly what they were building and why and where and how wide the break needed to be and which direction to work first. She assigned sections based on the tools they had, plows to the flat sections, scythes to the brush patches, shovels for turning earth at the edges. She put herself on a scythe because she was good with one, her father's farm having required it during harvest seasons, and she worked alongside them. The fire to the south was advancing. The sound of it was something she had not been prepared for, a roaring that was different from thunder, continuous and hungry. The orange light it threw on the sky was bright enough to work by when the lanterns were not enough, and she used it without sentiment, because there was no room for sentiment right now. Within 40 minutes, the first ranchers from town arrived. 7 men with tools and horses, and the wide-awake faces of people who had woken to fire on the horizon and come running. Emma moved to meet them, and she told them what she had told the others, and they went where she sent them without argument. And one of them, old Henderson, who had been farming the valley since before Emma was born, looked at her working the scythe and then looked at the break they were building and said to the man beside him, quietly but not quietly enough, "She's got it right. Look at the angle. She's got it exactly right." Emma heard him and said nothing and kept working. Robert arrived with 8 more people 50 minutes after they had started, and he rode straight to her and swung off his horse and took in the work already done with a single sweeping look. "The break is forming," he said, and it was not quite a question. 40 feet cleared on the south end, she said. "We need double that speed on the north section or the fire will flank us before we close the gap." She handed him a shovel from the supplies without pausing. "North end, take Henderson's son and the Calloway brothers." Robert took the shovel. He did not question the order. He went to the north end. The night was extraordinary and terrible. The fire was close enough now that they could see individual flames above the ridge line to the south, a wall of orange and red that moved with the wind like something alive and purposeful. The smoke was thick and the heat was reaching them even at this distance, and several of the town people who had come out in whatever they had grabbed threw it off because the cold was no longer the problem. Emma moved along the break line, checking the width, adjusting the work, redirecting people when a gap appeared or when the wind shifted slightly and changed the priority. She kept the map in her head now, having studied it long enough that the contour lines were part of her, and she moved through the dark by feel and calculation, and the map she carried internally. At 2 hours before dawn, the break was 2/3 complete and the fire was cresting the ridge. The roaring was overwhelming. The horses were terrified and had to be moved back and tied. Some of the workers were flagging, their energy depleted by hours of hard labor, and Emma went to each cluster and spoke to them, not with false reassurance but with the specific information they needed. How much was left, what had been accomplished, what would happen if they stopped now versus if they kept going. She spoke the truth and she made the truth motivating, which was what teaching had trained her to do. Robert, working the north end with the strength of a man who had been working hard land for 16 years and had reserves that went beyond the physical, saw her moving along the line and felt something he had no immediate word for. She was covered in ash and sweat and her hair had come entirely loose, and she was carrying a lantern and a shovel and speaking to exhausted people with the authority of someone who understood both the emergency and the humans in it. And the fire was roaring behind her on the ridge, and she was not afraid. She was not afraid. He thought of every person he had worked with in 16 years, men and women both, and he could not think of a single one who would have done what she was doing right now, not because they lacked courage, but because they lacked the combination of preparation, knowledge, specific skill, and unshakable clarity that she was bringing to this moment. She had seen this coming. She had calculated it. She had prepared for it. She had woken the valley and organized it and was now physically building the thing that would save it. alongside the people she had convinced to trust her. And she was doing it because she understood, as completely as any person could, what the alternative looked like. He was, in that moment, struck completely still by what he felt. It moved through him from his feet to the top of his head, a full and total shock of recognition. He was looking at the woman he intended to spend his life with. He turned and kept working, because she would have expected nothing less. At 3 hours after midnight, the break was nearly complete. There was a gap of perhaps 300 feet on the northeast section where the brush was thicker and the work had been slower, and the fire was coming down the ridge now, its leading edge visible and moving. Emma assessed the gap with her lantern and her knowledge and made the call in under 10 seconds. "We leave the gap," she said, "and we fire the back burn." The people nearest her looked at each other. "A back burn," she said, already moving. "We light the ground between the break and the fire on the cleared side, and we let it burn toward the fire. They meet, they consume each other's fuel, the advance stops." She was pulling the matches from her coat pocket because she had brought them. Of course she had brought them. "I need 3 people with me on the east end, 3 on the west. We light simultaneously on my signal and we move fast." Robert materialized at her side. "I'm east," he said. "West," she said. "I know what I'm doing." He looked at her and smiled despite everything and said, "I know. I've always known. East it is." The back burn was the most dangerous thing she had done in her life. She lit it herself, on her knees in the dry grass on the west end, touching flame to fuel, and then standing and moving back with the smooth, controlled economy of someone who had imagined this exact moment many times and knew what came next. The fire took. It ran east with the wind toward its larger counterpart. On the east end, Robert's section lit at the same moment she had signaled, and the 2 edges of the back burn raced toward each other and toward the advancing main fire. They met. The sound was enormous. For several seconds it seemed as if the fire was simply becoming larger, as if the back burn had been a catastrophic mistake, and Emma stood her ground and watched and counted internally, because she had calculated the fuel load and the wind speed and she trusted the calculation. Then the main fire's leading edge faltered. Its fuel was gone. It had nothing to advance onto because the back burn had consumed it, and without fuel, fire is nothing. The leading edge broke into patches and the patches diminished, and the roaring, which had been constant for 4 hours, began to change in quality, to become less continuous, to include gaps of something that sounded like the ordinary night wind. Grover Walsh, who was standing 20 feet from Emma, said something she could not hear over the fading roar. "What?" she said. "I said," he repeated louder, "it's working." She breathed. For the first time in 4 hours she took a full, deliberate breath, and she felt the exhaustion hit her like a physical thing because her body had been running on something else for 4 hours, and now the something else was easing off. The fire did not reach the valley. It died on the south slope, stopped by the firebreak and the back burn, in the gray light that was not yet dawn but was the beginning of the direction that dawn would come from. The smoke was still heavy and the air tasted of ash and the ground was scorched and black on the south slope, but the valley below the line was untouched. The farms were untouched. The town was untouched. Emma stood at the edge of the firebreak and looked at what they had built in one night with 23 exhausted people, and whatever they had in their hands, and she felt something that was not triumph exactly, because the threat had been real, and the night had been too hard for triumph, but something that was adjacent to it and deeper. Vindication, perhaps. The specific satisfaction of having been right about something that mattered and having acted on it before it was too late. Robert came to stand beside her. He was ash-covered and tired, and his shirt had a burn along one sleeve where a spark had caught, and he stood close enough that their shoulders touched. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Then he said, "How did you know about the back burn?" she said. "My father surveyed burn sites in Missouri. I read everything written about controlled burns after that. There is a paper by a German forester from 1861 that describes the technique in detail. I found it in the St. Louis Library during my second year of study. I have been thinking about this valley's specific topography and wind patterns in relation to that technique since approximately August." He turned and looked at her full on in the gray pre-dawn light. She said, "I know what you're thinking," he said. "You cannot possibly know what I'm thinking." She looked at him. He was looking at her with an expression she had not seen before, and she was good at reading faces. It was not quite admiration, though there was admiration in it. It was not quite astonishment, though there was astonishment in it. It was something larger than both, something that looked very much like the specific kind of recognition that you could not take back once it had happened. She said, more quietly, "What are you thinking?" he said. "I'm thinking that this valley is standing because of you. I'm thinking that you saw this coming when no one else could see it, and you prepared for it, and you got 23 people out of their beds in the middle of the night and built something that no one believed was necessary, and you were right about every single part of it." He paused. "I'm thinking that I am looking at the most extraordinary person I have ever met." She was quiet for a long moment. "You are the only person," she said, "who has ever said that to me without also implying that I should somehow be smaller about it." He stepped closer to her. The gray light was brightening on the eastern horizon, the real dawn beginning to suggest itself. The smoke was drifting north and thinning. Behind them the valley was waking up, beginning to understand what had almost happened and what had stopped it. "Emma," he said, "I would like to say something, and I want to say it now, before the sun comes up and everyone starts asking questions, because I have been working out how to say it for several months, and I think I have run out of excuses not to." She looked at him. "I love you," he said. "Not in spite of who you are, not around who you are, but because of exactly who you are, and I have been loving you since approximately the moment you showed me that topographical map in August and argued with me about the creek and turned out to be right about most of it." She breathed. The dawn was coming. The ash was in her hair and on her face, and her hands were blistered, and her boots were ruined, and she was standing at the edge of a firebreak she had built in the dark, and the man in front of her was the person who had showed up every single time and never once asked her to be different. "I love you too," she said. "I have been trying to find the right moment to say it, and I think this is the right moment, even if we are both covered in ash." He kissed her there at the edge of the firebreak, in the early gray light of the saved valley, with the smoke thinning above them and the dawn coming up cold and clear. And it was not a gentle or tentative kiss, but a full and honest one, the kind that meant everything they had both been building toward. Grover Walsh, turning back from the southern slope, saw them and turned right back around and found something to do elsewhere, which was the most diplomatic thing he had ever done. The weeks after the fire were extraordinary for Caldwell Creek. The town woke up to the knowledge of what had almost happened and what had prevented it, and the response was complex in the way that human responses to being saved tend to be. Part gratitude, part embarrassment at having dismissed the warning, part genuine and wholehearted wonder at what Emma had done. The town council called a special meeting and apologized, formally and specifically, for having not acted on her recommendations in October and November and December. The chairman of the council, a man named Whitmore who ran the hardware store, stood up at the front of the meeting hall and said words that Emma would remember not because they were eloquent but because they were honest. "This town was saved by a woman who knew things we should have listened to. We are resolved, from this point forward, to listen." Emma sat in the front row and accepted this with the grace of someone who had already moved past needing the acknowledgement, though she was human enough to find it satisfying. The Firebreak had also revealed something about the valley's geography that informed a more comprehensive planning effort. Over the spring, a permanent fire response system was established, based on Emma's original plan, with a rotating crew of trained volunteers, designated break lines, and a water supply system that Robert helped design and fund. Emma served on the planning committee, officially this time, as the resident expert, which title she wore without irony. She and Robert moved through the spring in the particular happiness of two people who know who they are to each other and are not keeping it a secret anymore. She rode out to the ranch on Sunday afternoons, and he was always either waiting for her or riding toward her on the road. And they rode the pastures together, and he talked about what he was building, and she talked about what she was teaching, and they talked about the land with the combined knowledge of a botanist and a 16-year rancher, which turned out to be a remarkably productive combination. His mother, Clara Blackwell, who had returned to the ranch after the fire to see for herself that her son was unharmed, met Emma on a Sunday in March, when Emma arrived with a pie she had made from the dried apples in her root cellar, and the specific intention of making a good impression. Clara Blackwell was a small, sharp woman in her early 60s who had survived more than most people and had developed, as a result, a very efficient system for evaluating new people. She looked at Emma for approximately 45 seconds and then said, "You're the one who stopped the fire." "With a great deal of help," Emma said. "That's not what Grover Walsh says," Clara said. "And Grover Walsh is not a man given to exaggeration." She accepted the pie. "Come inside." "Tell me about the back burn. My son tried to explain it, and he is better at doing things than explaining them." Emma came inside. She explained the back burn with full detail and enthusiasm, and Clara Blackwell listened with the complete attention of a woman who valued practical knowledge above most other things. And by the end of the afternoon, they had moved from fire science to botany to the management of the creek during drought years, and Clara had lent Emma 2 journals from the ranch's founding decade that contained detailed weather observations, which was exactly the kind of primary source Emma lived for. Robert came in from the barn to find his mother and Emma sitting at the kitchen table with journals spread between them, deep in animated conversation, and he stood in the doorway for a moment with the expression of a man who is witnessing something very good. Clara looked up at him. "Your young woman knows more about this land than most people who have been farming it their whole lives." "Yes," he said, "I know. She also makes an excellent pie." Emma looked at him with amusement. He said, "Also not a surprise." April brought the prairie green in a way that only happens after a fire has cleared the old dead growth, the new grass coming up astonishing and vivid in the black soil of the burned slope, and Emma walked those slopes and documented the regeneration with the botanical precision she brought to everything. It was, she thought, a useful reminder. Sometimes the most threatening thing became, in its aftermath, the thing that cleared space for something new. The school year ended in May with a presentation by her students that she had spent 3 months organizing. The children presented the valley's history, its geography, its current state, and its future prospects to the whole town in the community hall, using maps Emma had helped them draw and research Emma had taught them to do from primary sources. It was, by any measure, the best school presentation Caldwell Creek had ever seen, which was not a very high bar, but Emma did not believe in low bars. Robert sat in the front row and watched, and he felt that same thing he had felt in the schoolhouse in October, watching her teach, the feeling of a lamp being lit in a whole row of small faces, and he thought about the autumn and the winter and the fire and the dawn and everything between August and now, and he thought that he was the luckiest man in this valley and possibly in the state of Kansas. After the presentation, in the milling and congratulations that followed, he found her near the door, talking to a family whose daughter had done a particularly ambitious piece of research on the water table, and he waited, and when the family moved on he stepped to her and said, quietly, "Emma." She turned. He said, "Will you walk with me?" They walked out of the community hall and down the main street in the warm May evening, past the livery and the church courthouse and the dry goods store where he had ordered the book, and he guided her to the bench outside the schoolhouse, which was where a great many of the important things between them had happened, and he sat beside her. He had thought about how to do this carefully, in the way he thought about things that mattered. He had considered various approaches and rejected them for various reasons. He had not bought a ring in advance because he wanted to know her answer before he spent money on jewelry, which she would later describe as the most practical proposal set up in the history of the frontier and which he would not disagree with. He said, I want to talk about the future. She said. All right, he said. I have been thinking about it for a long time, and I keep arriving at the same conclusion, which is that the future I want has you in it, specifically and permanently. Not in it by proximity or by the accident of living in the same valley, but in it the way the firebreak is in the valley, which is to say, structurally, as an essential and load-bearing element. He paused. That is possibly the least romantic metaphor anyone has ever proposed with, she said, and there was something warm and slightly unsteady in her voice. It is extremely romantic to me. He said, Emma Merritt, I am asking you to marry me. I am asking you because you are the most remarkable person I have ever met, and because I love who you are, all of it, the maps and the calculations and the fire preparedness, and the 43 letters and the back burn at 2 in the morning, all of it. And because I think we would build something together that neither of us could build alone. And also because I think you already know that I would never ask you to stop teaching or to put your maps away or to be less than the full version of who you are. And I want you to know that I know that, and I think it matters. She was quiet for long enough that the evening birds were audible. Then she said, You are the first person who has ever seen all of who I am and wanted more of it rather than less. He waited. Yes, she said. Robert Blackwell, yes. He reached into his coat and brought out a ring that he had, in fact, had made by the jeweler in Wichita during a supply run the previous week, because he was practical about timing but not entirely without sentiment. It was a simple band with a small setting, not showy, not elaborate, exactly right. She held out her hand. He put it on. She looked at it for a moment in the May evening light. It fits, she said. I measured your finger, he said, while you were asleep at the kitchen table over the fire committee reports in January. She looked at him. That is either very romantic or very methodical. Both, he said. I am learning from you. She laughed, and he kissed her there on the bench in front of the schoolhouse, as the evening light faded over the valley that they had, between them, saved. They married in July, in the church courthouse, on a morning that was clear and warm without being dangerously dry, which Emma noted with satisfaction. The whole town came, which in Caldwell Creek meant approximately 200 people filling the church to capacity and overflowing onto the steps. Grover Walsh served as Robert's best man and made a speech that was short and honest and mentioned the night of the fire in terms that made several people tear up, including the speaker. Clara Blackwell sat in the front row in her best dress and looked at her son and his wife with an expression that was private and deep. Emma wore a dress she had made from blue wool with a white collar, not a traditional bridal gown, because this was the frontier in 1882, and practicality was a virtue. But she wore her father's compass on a chain around her neck, which she had decided was the right thing to carry on this particular day. Robert, standing at the front of the church watching her walk toward him down the aisle, thought that he had seen her in a lot of different configurations. In chalk-covered teaching mode and fireline mode and lamplit kitchen mode and riding across the pasture mode. And she was compelling in all of them. But the version of her walking toward him in the blue dress with her father's compass around her neck, and her face absolutely clear and open in a way she usually only let him see. This version stopped his breath in a specific and permanent way. The ceremony was performed by the minister, who had been Emma's ally in the fire committee discussions and who married them with evident warmth. The vows were the traditional ones, and they said them with the directness of two people who meant every word. I do, Emma said, in her clear, steady voice. I do, Robert said, looking at her. The summer and early autumn that followed were the kind of months that people look back on later and recognize as the building of a life. Emma continued teaching and Robert continued ranching, and they occupied the farmhouse at the Blackwell Ranch, where Robert had built on 2 additional rooms in the spring with enough time to spare, having planned ahead in the way that he did everything. Emma's books filled 2 new shelves he had built against the east wall, and her maps were given a dedicated table near the window that got the best light, and her father's surveying equipment had a place in the corner of the study, because this was a house that understood what its people needed. She loved the ranch in a way she had not expected. She loved the morning rhythms, the animals, the sense of a large living system managed with care and intelligence. She brought her botanical knowledge to the pasture management questions and found, as she had during the fire planning, that the combination of her knowledge and his experience produced better answers than either alone. He brought her perspective to the water management decisions and found the same thing. They argued productively and regularly, and never about anything fundamental, only about the best approach to practical problems, which was the kind of arguing that ends with both people having learned something. She taught through the autumn with the extra vitality that came from the changes in her personal life, and her students had an exceptionally good year. Robert came to the schoolhouse on certain Tuesdays and sat in the back and watched her teach and felt, still, the same thing he had felt the first time. In November, almost exactly 1 year after the fire, she told him she was expecting a child. He was in the barn when she came to tell him, checking a horse's tendon in the way he did after a hard ride, careful and methodical, and she came and stood in the barn doorway with her coat on and her direct gray eyes and said, "I have some news." He looked up. She said, "We are going to have a child. In the late spring, I estimate." He stood up from the horse and was across the barn in 3 steps and had her in his arms before he had quite thought through the sequence of events. She put her arms around him, and he held her in the barn with the horses moving gently in their stalls and the November cold at the door, and he said nothing for a moment because there was too much to say. Then he said against her hair, "Are you well?" "I am perfectly well," she said. "I have been reading extensively on the subject." He laughed. "Of course you have. I have also been calculating the due date against the school calendar, and I believe I can teach through April if I plan accordingly." He pulled back to look at her face. It was full of the thing he had seen there since August of last year, the particular aliveness that was Emma being fully herself, and it was also, he thought, something new, something that had just arrived, something that made the fullness fuller. "Emma," he said, "yes. I love you more than I have words for." She held his gaze. "I know," she said. "I love you the same way." The winter was gentle, merciful, bringing the moisture the land had needed for 2 years, rain in December and snow in January, and the creek running full by February. Emma watched the water levels with profound satisfaction and updated her logs and noted that the moisture deficit was resolved, and the fire risk for the coming dry season was substantially reduced. She shared this information at the fire committee's quarterly meeting, which she still attended, because the committee had become a permanent feature of Caldwell Creek's emergency preparedness structure, and she was its founding intelligence. The committee now operated out of a dedicated room in the sheriff's office, which was a direct result of the new sheriff, a man named Dale Perkins, who had replaced the ineffective Denton after the fire, and who had from the beginning treated Emma's expertise with the straightforward respect it deserved. The committee had 6 trained volunteers, 2 sets of Firebreak tools in public storage, a water relay system designed by Robert and built by the community over the previous summer, and a seasonal risk assessment protocol that Emma had written and which the committee followed. She was large with the pregnancy by March and moved through her school days with the practical adaptation of someone who did not consider physical inconvenience a legitimate reason to stop doing what mattered. Her students were, as a group, serenely unconcerned about their teacher's condition, because she was unconcerned about it, and they took their cues from her. A few of the older girls asked careful questions that Emma answered honestly and informatively, which she thought was the correct approach to anything. Robert was attentive in the way that he was attentive about everything, thorough and steady, and never patronizing. He rode with her when she needed to go to town rather than letting her ride alone, not because he thought she couldn't manage it, but because he wanted to be there, which she understood was different, and she appreciated the distinction. He made sure the house was warm and the food was good, and that she had everything she needed for the school without having to plan around additional physical effort. Clara Blackwell came to stay in April, sent by herself from the neighboring county, where she had been spending the winter with Robert's sister, arriving with the specific authority of a woman who had done this before and had opinions about it. She and Emma had by this point developed the easy understanding of two women who respected each other's competence and did not need to establish hierarchy between them. Clara managed the kitchen and the household and told Emma firmly to sit down when Emma was trying to do 3 things at once, and Emma generally listened, because Clara was usually right. The baby came on a night in late May, which was perfect timing in Emma's view because the school year had concluded 2 weeks prior. He was a boy born healthy and loud, and they named him Thomas James Blackwell, Thomas for Emma's father and James for Robert's. He was born in the bedroom of the farmhouse on a warm spring night with Clara attending and Robert present throughout, holding Emma's hand with the particular steadiness that was one of his great qualities. When it was over and the baby was placed in Emma's arms for the first time, she looked at her son for a long time without speaking. Then she looked at Robert, who was sitting beside the bed with the expression of a man who has just witnessed something that has permanently expanded his understanding of what is possible. "Thomas," she said. "Thomas," he agreed. Clara, from the doorway, said, "He has the Blackwell ears," which was a thing she had apparently been waiting to say. Emma looked at Robert's ears and then at the baby's ears and then at Robert. He shrugged, which was an entirely uncharacteristic gesture for him, and which made her laugh despite being exhausted, and the laugh woke the baby, who made a sound of protest, and Clara came in and told them both to settle down. Thomas James Blackwell was a vigorous and thoroughly interested baby, who appeared to have inherited his mother's tendency to want to know how everything worked, and his father's physical self-possession, which was a combination that would, in later years, produce either a scientist or a very thoughtful rancher. He was, in the year following his birth, the primary subject of all discussions at the Blackwell Ranch, and a substantial portion of the discussions in Caldwell Creek generally, because the town had developed, through the events of the previous fire season and the establishment of the emergency committee and the school improvements and the wedding, a particular affection for the Blackwells as a unit. Emma returned to teaching in September with Thomas in a crib at the back of the classroom, which she had discussed with the school board, and which the school board had approved, because the alternative was losing the best teacher they had ever had. The students took turns watching him during lessons, which worked out to a supplementary child development unit that she had not planned but found genuinely educational for everyone involved. She was happy. She was happy in the particular way of someone who has found the specific place where their particular combination of capacities is needed and valued, where the person standing beside them sees them completely, where the work is real and the love is real, and the life has the weight and texture of something built rather than merely occupied. Robert was happy in the same way, which was to say, deeply and quietly, and with full knowledge of what he had. He looked at his wife across the kitchen table in the evenings, bent over her planning books with the lamp pulling out the reddish notes in her dark hair, and he thought about the night of the fire and the gray dawn above the break line and everything that had come from that, and he felt the specific and irreplaceable satisfaction of a life that was exactly where it was supposed to be. 2 years after the fire, Caldwell Creek held a public commemoration of the night of the Firebreak, organized by the town council with the particular thoroughness of an organization that has learned to be thorough the hard way. It was held in the school hall, which had been expanded by community effort the previous spring, and it was attended by every family in the valley. Emma was asked to speak. She accepted, and she spoke about the fire the way she spoke about everything, with full information and no false modesty and a precise understanding of what had actually happened and why. She described the night, the calculations, the back burn, the 23 people who had built the break in the dark. She described what the valley had been at risk of losing: the farms, the livestock, the homes, the school, the lives that had been built here. She described what had made the response possible: not heroism in the abstract, but specific preparation, specific knowledge, specific trust between specific people. She did not make it about herself. But she did say, near the end of her remarks, something that the people in the room would repeat to each other for years. The fire taught this valley something that I think we already knew but perhaps needed to be reminded of, which is that the people in the best position to protect a community are not always the people who have held the formal authority to do so. Knowledge is not a function of gender or title. Preparation is not gendered. The willingness to act in the face of danger in the middle of the night is not gendered. What this valley needed was someone who could see the threat clearly and had prepared for it. What I needed was people willing to trust that preparation. She paused. I have been grateful every day since for having had both. Robert, sitting in the front row with Thomas on his knee, felt his throat close briefly in the way it did when something hit him exactly at the center of what mattered. After the event, walking home across the spring prairie with Thomas asleep in Robert's arms and the stars very clear above the valley that had survived, Emma walked close at Robert's side and he shifted Thomas to one arm so that his other hand was free and she took it. They walked in silence for a while, which was the kind of silence that did not need filling. Then she said, "Are you happy?" He looked at her sideways in the starlight. "What kind of question is that?" "A genuine one," she said. He said, "Emma, I am the happiest I have ever been in my life. I have been happy specifically and continuously since approximately the evening in August when you showed me a topographical map and argued with me about the creek." She said, "You were wrong about the creek, by the way. My original measurement was correct." He said, "I know, I rechecked it in November." He smiled. "I chose not to mention it," she said. "I appreciate the restraint." And then she leaned into him, tucking herself against his side as they walked, and he adjusted his arm to include her without breaking stride, and they walked home through the Kansas night toward the lit window of their house and the future that was already happening all around them. In the years that came after, the Blackwell Ranch expanded and prospered and became one of the model operations in Sumner County, not only for its cattle production, but for its innovative pasture management practices, which were documented and published in an agricultural circular by Emma, who had submitted the findings with Robert's full co-authorship credited because the knowledge was genuinely shared. She was one of the few women published in an agricultural context in the state of Kansas in the 1880s, and she was entirely aware that this was unusual and entirely uninterested in pretending otherwise. The school grew. She trained 2 additional teachers over the following years, young women who came west as she had come, with their books and their determination, and she taught them as her father had taught her, thoroughly and honestly, and with the conviction that a person who could only do one thing was a person who was one bad day away from helplessness. Thomas grew up on the ranch and in the schoolhouse with equal fluency, learning the land from his father and the breadth of the world from his mother, and showing, by the time he was 8, the combination of physical capability and careful intelligence that made his parents exchange a look of recognition across the breakfast table. When he was 2, a daughter came. They named her Clara Rose Blackwell, for Robert's mother and for the wild roses that grew at the edge of the eastern pasture. Clara Rose was, from the beginning, a child who combined her mother's sharp focus with her father's physical confidence, and she was the specific delight of her grandmother Clara, who came to stay for extended periods and pronounced both grandchildren exactly as they ought to be. Emma, in the evenings of those years, still kept her maps. She updated her fire risk logs as a habit, because habits of careful attention do not stop being useful simply because the immediate crisis has passed. She still attended the fire committee, which continued to function and which had never, in the years following the break, needed to be activated in emergency conditions, partly because of the improved moisture patterns, and partly because the valley had learned what it was supposed to do. Robert knew she kept the logs and found them. Each time he noticed the updated entries in the evening lamplight, deeply reassuring. The valley was watched. The valley was understood. The valley had someone paying attention with full and careful intelligence, and that person was his wife, and he thought there was probably nowhere in Kansas safer. One evening in the autumn of 1886, 4 years after the fire, Emma looked up from her maps and said to Robert, across the kitchen table where their own domestic history had accumulated in layers of maps and journals and coffee cups and the occasional small handprint from Thomas or Clara Rose, "Do you ever think about the night of the fire?" He looked up from the account book he had been working through. "Often," he said. "What do you think about?" He considered. "The back burn," he said. "Watching you light it. Watching you stand there after and wait while everyone else was sure it had gone wrong, and knowing you knew it was right." She looked at him. "I was not entirely certain," she said. "I was approximately 92% certain." "The 8%, he said, "you didn't show it." "Showing the 8%, she said, "would not have helped anyone build the remaining section of the break." "No," he said, "it would not have." He set down his pen and looked at her fully the way he always looked at her when she had just said something that crystallized something. "Emma, Robert, I have been thinking about something." She waited. "I would like to hire a second ranch foreman," he said, "so that I can attend the fire committee meetings with you. Not because you need me there. You don't need me there. But because the things you are doing are important and I would like to be present for them, and I have been calculating for a while whether the operation can sustain the cost, and I believe it can." She looked at him. He said, "Also, I would like to ride the southern slopes with you this autumn when you do your seasonal survey, the way we did in the first year." She said quietly, "Yes, I would like that." He said, "And I think, if you're willing, we might consider whether the eastern pasture would benefit from the controlled burn protocol you have been developing in the circular. The grass there is older growth and the soil nutrients." "Robert," she said. "Yes." "Stop talking about the pasture," she said, "and come here." He came around the table and she stood up, and he put his arms around her in the kitchen of their house, with the maps on the table and the lamp burning and the Kansas night outside the window, autumn dark and soft and carrying the smell of good rain. And she put her head against his shoulder, and he held her the way he had held her since the night of the fire, which was the way you hold something that is both strong and precious, with full hands, and the understanding that the strength is not diminished by being held. They stood there for a while in the quiet of the evening, and the house was full of the small sounds of children sleeping, and the settling of wood and the ordinary comfort of a life built by two people who had found each other across the space of a Kansas valley, and built something that was, in every measurable sense, worth building. Outside, the prairie was green and watered and restful. The southern slope showed no glow on its horizon. The stars were out in their thousands above the valley that had been saved by a schoolteacher with maps and a plan, and a compass from her father and a man who had listened to her, and showed up at the right moment. And the two of them had built everything that came after from that single extraordinary night, and that single gray dawn above the Firebreak. Emma Merritt Blackwell closed her eyes in the warm circle of her husband's arms and felt the completeness of it, the full, abundant, deeply earned completeness of a life that was exactly, precisely right. The valley was safe. The children were sleeping. The maps were updated. The man she loved was present and steady in hers. There was nothing else in all of Kansas that she needed.